Hey guys, welcome back to another Reddit stories video. Today we're gonna be reading more Reddit stories. You guys love these, so I'm gonna keep making them. This is the perfect kind of thing to, put on in the background while you're sleeping or studying or just chilling. So yeah, be sure to subscribe, follow my Instagram, everything in the description, and let's get straight into these. Night out at the 10 p.m. diner. Every night, a different person walks down the street and screams for help. We aren't allowed to help them. Looking back, I feel dumb. Completely stupid, actually. I should have known that apartment was far too cheap to be right, even for a studio. I should have known there had to be a catch. The day I moved in was a complete blur. I insisted that no one help me, not wanting to prove any of my family members' suspicions about my character. By late afternoon, all my muscles ached terribly and my head throbbed. I fell back on my bare mattress, staring up at the ceiling fan with glazed-over eyes. I pulled the damp strands of hair from my sweaty forehead, wincing in disgust. Someone knocked on my door, causing me to jump. I cursed under my breath, pushing myself up on my elbows. Two girls were peeking around my doorframe. Foolishly, I'd left it wide open, forgetting the old college rule. Only leave your door open if you want to make new friends. And I was not in the mood to make new friends. One of them, an Asian girl with choppy black hair, was grinning at me. The other stood a little further back, fingering a box of Marlboro Reds. "Hey," she said, nodding at me. Her voice was smooth and raspy at the same time. "Did you just move in?" I laid back down, rubbing my face with both hands, choosing not to bother with manners. "Yeah, about 5 seconds ago." "Cool." The girls walked in, evidently ignoring my very clear body language. The girl with the black hair ran her fingers along the edge of my desk and then picked up a little ceramic duck from my unpacked box of trinkets. "Grandma," I explained, feeling strangely defensive. "Cute," she replied, holding it up to her face. "Has anyone told you yet?" The other girl asked abruptly, looking around my apartment. She had tucked the cigarettes into the back pocket of her jeans and was now tugging at her long red braids. "Jesus, Gianna, give her a second." "Well, she needs to know." "Yeah, but we haven't even asked her name." I blinked at the two strangers incredulously. I hadn't even had enough time to put toilet paper in my bathroom, and here they were, touching my things and talking about me like I wasn't there. I just wanted to take a nap, honestly. "My name's Arden," I said. The girl with the red braids, Gianna, sat down next to me on my bed. "Did they tell you?" "Tell me what?" "Oh, of course they didn't. The rules." I blinked again, my face blank. I didn't know about any rules besides the typical renting ones. I had signed the lease after, at best, skimming over it. The landlord was a skinny woman who smelled of ashes, and I was fairly certain she had never developed the facial muscles necessary for smiling. I wasn't about to ask her any follow-up questions, especially when the rent was so cheap. The other girl laughed nervously. "Where did you move here from?" I ignored her. "What rules?" Gianna got a strange, wicked sort of smile on her face, bouncing a little on my mattress. The other girl sighed loudly. "Something happens here every night," she began, pulling out my rickety office chair and sitting down. "Something weird." "Like what?" I sat up, frowning at her. Finally, my interest was piqued. "Someone walks down the street," Gianna said, her voice reminding me of a camp counselor telling me a scary story about the bonfire. "That one, right down there." She pointed at my window. "It's someone different each night. They scream for help for about an hour, but we aren't supposed to help them." I just stared at her. I felt a small chill run up my spine. I didn't know what to make of all this. "It happens at a different time every night," the other one said, softly. "We never know when it's coming." "Why?" She shrugged, almost sadly. "We don't know why." I scoffed, leaning my elbows against my knees. "I don't believe you." The girl shrugged. "You don't have to. You'll see for yourself." The look in her eyes made me want to believe her. She seemed sincere, but I couldn't even begin to fathom what they were saying being true. It was too strange, too outlandish. I knew this wouldn't be the nicest neighborhood, but it couldn't be that bad. It had to be a prank. They had to be hazing me or something. "We'll come back later," Gianna said matter-of-factly. "We'll show you." Before I could protest, she grabbed the other girl by the wrist and they were gone. I followed them to the door, watching them march down the hall, talking to each other in hushed voices. I closed the door behind them. That night, as promised, they came back. They came dragging along two boys. One was somewhat muscular, wearing a tight black t-shirt and baggy jeans, and my eyes were instantly drawn to a silver heart-shaped locket around his neck. He smiled at me and introduced himself as Will when he walked in. The other boy was smaller but chubbier and nervous-looking, with a buzz cut and ill-fitting cargo shorts. His name, I was told, was Mateo. The girl named Gianna came in carrying a bottle of wine and that same slight, crumpled box of cigarettes. The other one, the girl I still didn't know the name of, was the only one who looked even somewhat apologetic. They all sat down on my dusty floor next to the window and motioned for me to join them. I sat between Will and the nameless girl, unsure whether I should continue feeling violated or if I should just give in to my strange, pushy neighbors. "Do you all live in this building?" I asked, hesitantly accepting the wine when it was passed to me. "Yeah," Will answered with a grin. It seemed half-hearted. "This building is where all the young people live. It's where they put us," Gianna cut in, lighting a cigarette. It didn't even occur to me to tell her not to smoke inside. "We've been sorted out. Forgive her, she's a bit of a conspiracy theorist." "It's not a theory," she snapped, glaring at him. "Look at the other ones. Next door, the middle-agers, people with kids but no grandkids. Across the street, old people. Not a single 20-something in that entire building. May, tell him." So her name was May. I looked over at her, admiring her smoky eye makeup and how she'd tied up her hair, long strands poking out like exploding fireworks. "Stop it," May muttered, reaching for the wine bottle. "You'll scare her." "I'm not scared." She just shrugged at me as if she didn't believe me. We passed the bottle around and then around again. I listened to them bicker and laugh. It was clear they'd all been friends for a while, and I felt a little bit like I was intruding, even though they were in my apartment. Will asked me if I'd gone to college, and I told him I did, but I dropped out. They all nodded sympathetically, which made me feel stupid. By midnight, I was a little bit buzzed, and my guard was beginning to fall. I had to admit, it felt good to have friends. I already mentally resigned myself to a life of solitude, at least for a while, but it seemed that might not actually have to be my fate. I laughed at Mateo and Gianna's drunken argument, passing a cigarette back and forth with May, blowing the smoke out of my open window. I had almost completely forgotten why they were over when it happened. All at once, a blaring alarm came from each of our phones like an Amber Alert. I could hear the sound echo throughout the neighborhood like an entire chorus of hundreds of phones going off, not just ours. I nearly leapt out of my skin. Not even Gianna laughed. All of them were quiet, and they looked at me as I took it out, frowning at the screen. "Do not interfere." "It's coming," Will whispered. He had changed, his eyes almost glassy, and his voice soft and shaky. Mateo squeezed his shoulder. I looked at May. Her eyebrows were cinched together in concern, and she was stubbing out our cigarette against the windowsill, shrinking away. And there it was again, that chill. It crept up my back, spreading along my scalp and making me shiver. Something felt deeply, deeply wrong. The others were quiet now, staring silently at the window I was sitting up against. The air felt somehow warmer, like it was buzzing with something. Maybe I was just sweating. We sat there unmoving for what felt like half an hour. Right as I was getting tempted to ask what was going on, I heard it. It was far away and faint, but I still heard it. A cry. It continued as it got gradually closer, louder, more desperate. "Help! Please, my God, someone help me!" Slowly I leaned out the window. I had to see it with my eyes, had to confirm there was actually someone out there like they had said there would be. My new apartment was on the 4th floor, so it was hard to see who was down the street without squinting. In the flickering streetlights, I could make out the outline of an elderly man. He was hunched over, wandering aimlessly from door to door, wearing only what looked like a hospital gown to cover his pale, broken body. Behind him trailed a path of dripping blood, although I couldn't see where it was coming from. "Please, I'm hurt." I looked back at the others, my mouth hanging open. "What is this?" I demanded loudly. "What the hell is this?" May touched my arm, trying to calm me down. I pulled away from her. "Arden, please. We have to help him. Why can't we help him? He's just an old man." "We can't help him. Trust me." I ignored her, leaning further out the window, prepared to call out to him. Before I could open my mouth, I froze. The man down there was still now, facing our building. His head was tilted upwards, and I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew he was looking right at me. I immediately felt cold, like I was plummeting into ice water. "Help me," he whimpered into the silent night air, his voice barely audible. Then he began to scream. That scream wasn't human, or at least not any human I'd ever met. It was desperate, agonized. It made my stomach turn and my eyes prick with tears. I couldn't look away. The blood was coming from his arms, or should I say, his lack of arms. Where his arms should be, there were only bloody, mangled stumps. They looked fresh. He didn't move other than a shaky sway, and his eyes didn't leave me. His shrieks slowly molded into words that I could just barely understand. "Please, please, please, please!" May yanked me backwards away from the window. I landed on my ass and yelped in pain and horror. "What is that thing?" I whispered. I didn't mean to whisper, but that was all that came out. We don't know, May replied, her eyes trained on Will, who was crying now. Mateo held on to him like he might topple over. We just need to follow the rules. What happens if you don't follow the rules? I asked, and immediately regretted it. Will sobbed softly. Outside, the old man wailed. Gianna reached over and pulled the window shut, but it somehow did nothing to muffle the blood-curdling sound. Do you want to tell her, or should I? Mateo asked Will. Will just shook his head. He was clutching his locket now, turning the little heart over between his fingers. Mateo sighed and turned towards me. A couple of months ago, one of them got to Will's girl. Shannon, Gianna butted in. Her name was Shannon. Her name is Shannon. I swallowed, but whatever I did, nothing would force down the lump in my throat. What happened? Mateo shook his head. We don't know. We were all together when the screaming started. Usually we just ignore it now, no use in dwelling in it. But that night, we think she saw something different. She started insisting she had to help, and she ran outside. We couldn't stop her. He paused, glancing over at Will. He was silent and still. The screaming outside had begun to pass, getting softer as it continued further down the street. Then what? He shrugged. Nothing. She was just gone. I pressed my lips together, trying to process all of this. I really had believed they were messing with me, but I had seen it. I'd witnessed it firsthand, and it terrified me. Why doesn't anyone leave? He shrugged for a second time. Can't afford it, or people just don't care. Some people have left, but we all signed an NDA with the lease, so nobody ever knows. I frowned, thinking back to signing the paperwork, trying to remember. I could vaguely picture what he was talking about. I'd assumed it was just more legal jargon I would never understand. Had I seriously signed a non-disclosure agreement without even noticing? After that, I told them I wanted to go to bed. I needed time to process all of this. They understood, and each one of them said goodbye before leaving me alone. As I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, for some reason I thought of May's face when we had realized it was happening. How she'd put out the cigarette and backed away from the window. Eventually, I was able to drift off to sleep. The next few weeks were difficult. I spent more and more time with my new neighbors. I came to find that they were right. I don't think there was a single person older than 30 in our entire building, but I saw them all the time leaving the one next door. Settling in was difficult. The others seemed so used to it. They cared, of course. It scared them, especially Will. But you could tell they had been here a while by the way they sighed, closing the blinds, focusing harder on whatever they were doing. Eventually, I began to mimic them. It helped a little bit to pretend it was normal, as strange as that sounds. Moving out wasn't really an option for me anyways. I was a college dropout and I hadn't found a job yet. I was still just getting by on what I managed to save up. Every night it was someone different. Some were more human, some seemed less. Some were drenched in blood, their clothes ripped and strange, but some looked fairly normal. The worst were the children. They would run like injured chickens, screeching and banging on doors, begging for help. Sometimes they would try different things, say different things. Like, they're coming. Like, I don't want to die. Or even, I'm sorry. There were a lot of children. One night, while I was half awake, an alarm went off. It wasn't like the one on our phones, it was blaring, only somewhat muffled by my window. My apartment glowed a flashing red from outside. I didn't even look. I was too scared of what I might see. I just covered my head with my pillow and tried to fall back asleep. I came to learn all the theories, especially from Gianna. She thought we had all been chosen and predetermined to live here, all for some sick government game. She thought maybe there were people betting on the different buildings, putting down money on who would interfere the least. See that? She said to me one day in the hallway, returning from a coffee run. Cameras everywhere. I didn't know if I believed her. I spent time with May, mostly. We smoked on the front steps and people watched. It was strange to see what at night was such a sinister and gruesome neighborhood during the day, bright and lively. She didn't talk much about the rules, so I didn't either. We didn't talk all that much in general. I found just enjoying each other's company. Right when I was beginning to feel comfortable was when it happened. It all started with a birthday cake. Happy birthday! As May walked through the door, Mateo blew into his plasticky party horn. The paper inflated, smacking Will in the side of the head. May's hand flew to her heart. Jesus Christ, you fuckers know I hate surprises. Gianna laughed and walked over to her. In her hand, she held a chocolate cake, haphazardly adorned with sprinkles and bright pink icing that read, Happy Birthday, May, in the center. 24. She set down the cake on the dresser and threw her arm around May's neck. How does it feel? Fucking awful. That's the spirit. Enough of this, Mateo cut in, weaving between them. Let's eat some cake, then let's go. Their tradition, I'd learned, was to bar hop for birthdays. They told me there was no curfew here despite the rules, just a recommended time to be home, which was 10:30. Usually, they said they got home before the alarm or spent the night somewhere else. We all took some cake. The boys took shots in the kitchen to pregame while I watched Gianna fuss over May's hair. I was never much of a partier. While at clubs or bars in college, I spent most of the time out back chatting with the smokers. But then again, I was never much of a friend group person either, so maybe the circumstances were changing. I watched them all troop outside to Mateo's car. I stuffed myself in the back, incredibly conscious of how close I was pressed into May, my other shoulder rammed into the car door. Mateo's music, cranked up to the maximum volume, hurt my ears, and the tiny space was packed with the smell of tobacco and various perfumes as we sped down the freeway toward the city, but it was nice. It was really nice. I found myself laughing with them, and I hooked my arm around May's when she weaseled her hand beneath my elbow. It was actually nice. As predicted, the bars they chose weren't exactly my scene. But this time, as opposed to college, I could stand it. I took shots, I followed them out for smoke breaks, I even danced under the low purple lights until my feet ached inside my chunky heels, surely riddled with blisters. By the time we got to our third bar, I couldn't feel it anymore. And it was at that third bar that we crammed ourselves into an old photo booth, and Gianna reluctantly offered $5 for the slot, and we laughed, red-faced, into a tiny camera. After the photos spit out into the compartment, the others slid through the red curtains. But before I could follow, May grabbed my wrist. She held me back, sliding her long baby blue nails up my wrist. I shivered. "You never gave me a birthday present," she whispered, and I could feel her breath on my face. If I was wearing my glasses, they would have been fogging up. "Yeah, well, I didn't get to finish my quip before she kissed me. It was nice, and then it wasn't." "Hey!" Will called out to me, squeezing through a crowd of men wearing tattered leather jackets to get to me. "Arden, where's everybody else?" I blinked, looking around. I could have sworn they had been right there a second ago, but now none of them were anywhere to be found. I shrugged. "Dunno. Why, what's up?" He finally broke free from the swaying mass and I got a better look at him. He looked worried. His face was flushed and I could see a few drops of sweat creeping out from his hairline. He took his phone out of his pocket and held it out to me. First, I saw his home screen. It was him next to a girl with strawberry blonde hair, both clutching beer bottles and grinning widely at the camera. Then I looked where he actually wanted me to. The time, 1:47 a.m. "It's getting late," he narrated. "Can we find the others and get going?" I understood then. He was worried. It was past 1 a.m. and no alarm yet. It was later than usual. The bars would start closing soon. He wanted to get back before it happened. Will and I weaved through the crowd. I was pretty buzzed, and I realized I was having a hard time moving my feet right, which made me feel embarrassed. I hadn't even had that much to drink. Was I that much of a lightweight? We found them outside, chain smoking. Will explained the situation while I swayed. The drive back was strangely tense. Mateo's music was turned down, and there wasn't any joking or boisterous gossiping like there had been on the way out. We all felt it. It didn't need to be said. Something was off. Will drove fast, almost reckless. In the dark, May took my hand. Just as he was careening around the last corner and we could almost make out the shape of our apartment building down the street, it happened. All of our phones went off at once. Gianna let out a small shriek from the other side of the back seat. "Do not interfere." Mateo turned back towards us, pressing his finger to his lips. Had this ever happened before? By their reactions, I didn't think so. It was different when it came when I was in my bedroom, when I could just shut the curtains and put my headphones on. I felt so small and helpless then, like I was gazing into the maw of something incomprehensibly beyond my understanding. I felt like we were all flies, and this neighborhood right now was the spider's web. Will drove slowly now, maybe 5 miles an hour. We were all still, we were all silent, not even a stray breath cut through the quiet. Underneath the glowing streetlights, I can make out the side of Will's face. He was pale, and if I hadn't seen his knee shifting as he pressed down on the brakes, I could have mistaken him for a mannequin. The car came to a stop. I followed his gaze all the way down the street to the dark horizon, and I saw what he saw. A silhouette. It was far too distant to make out what shape it took, but it was evidently humanoid. It moved in a shaky stumble, limping down the middle of the road in our direction, and in the overwhelming silence I could hear it, far away but still deeply urgent. "Help me, Will," Gianna hissed. Turned the car around. Will didn't move, he just stared forward as white as paper. It didn't make any logical sense, but I knew what he knew. It was too late now. There was no use. "Help me, please help." I could tell now that it was a girl from its voice, and its figure as it got closer. It was wearing some sort of white nightgown, not unlike the old man's hospital attire from that first night, stained with dark red blood. From here, I couldn't tell if it was fresh or dry. I didn't know why that mattered to me. Maybe, May whispered. Her arm shook against mine. Maybe if we're quiet and we duck down, it won't see us. Deep down, it felt as hopeless as turning around had felt, but it seemed reasonable. I nodded and did as she suggested, crouching behind the passenger seat, my knees throbbing from the strange angle I'd bent myself into. We all did it, except for Will. He didn't move. He just looked. When he finally spoke, I could barely hear him. It was so weak. Shannon. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mateo was the one to break the silence. What? Shannon, he repeated, finally turning his head to look at his friend. That's Shannon. I peered over the seat in front of me, squinting my eyes. The human-like thing was getting closer, and now I could make out strawberry blonde hair, round face, short legs. The girl from Will's phone lock screen. The girl who had disappeared. Shannon. May gasped next to me. Dude, Mateo said slowly, his words crumbling as soon as they left his mouth. I know what you're thinking, dude. Do not get out of this car. Will didn't even seem like he was with us anymore. He was in shock, I think, looking back. I have to help her, he insisted, right as another sickening cry rang out. Help me! Help! Help me, please, someone! It hurts! It was getting far too close for us for comfort, but it didn't seem to notice the car. Its cries became more and more desperate as they got louder. I have to help her, Will repeated, and a bit of life had returned to his voice. Mateo shook his head and grabbed at his sleeve. Will, that is not Shannon. Will glared at him, his eyes shining with tears. I know Shannon. That's her. I know you do, dude, and I know you miss her, but please, please don't do this. Their voices were getting louder and more distraught, and I felt May press into my side, trembling like a leaf. Gianna was whimpering, and I couldn't see her from my position. The thing was almost to our car when it stopped. She turned her head, left, then right, almost like she was sniffing the air. The boys stopped arguing. I felt like my heart would burst right out of my chest. I could see Shannon's face now, and I realized why she hadn't seen us. The girl's face was streaked with gore, and it looked like her eyes had been scooped out with a melon spoon. She cried, drool pouring from her slackened mouth, but no tears would come. It happened too quickly. None of us could stop him. Will violently ripped his arm away from Mateo, fumbling for the handle to the car door. Gianna screamed. Mateo tried to slam down on the lock, but he missed, and Will managed to get the door open before he could try again. He stumbled onto the asphalt and hit the ground with a soft crunch. The thing turned her head and began to scream. But instead of charging at Will, she backed away. She held her arms out in front of her like something might attack her, whipping her head around wildly. An alarm went off, like the one I had heard that one night, but far more unbearable now that I was in it. The street lights lining either side of the street switched to a flashing red, and Mateo threw himself into the driver's seat, the tires screeching as he peeled away. Gianna was screaming at him, pleading with him to go back. May was weeping into her hands. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, I didn't understand. As we sped away, I looked back. I couldn't help it. I saw the flash of some sort of van in the blinding red light, pulling around the corner. Then nothing. That was a week or two ago. I don't know. I've been having a hard time keeping track of time. None of us have spoken much since that night. We tried the police, of course, but as you could assume, nothing came out of it. I think whatever this is far larger than we know. I don't know if it's some kind of experiment or just a sick game, but I'm going to move back into my parents' house next week, despite all their berating, and then figure out what to do from there. I don't know if that really was Shannon that we saw that night, or if it was something else, and I don't know which is worse. All I know is that last night, I heard Will's voice outside my window, crying, pleading for help. I didn't interfere. There's people in the basement. Hey man, I don't know how to tell you this, but there's people in the basement. Chris's words were in between a silence and a whisper. I sat up in the bed, my eyes adjusting to the frantic figure in front of me. What? I asked him. What are you talking about? Be quiet, dude, he whispered. There's people in the fucking basement, like 6 of them, I swear to God. He paused, taking a few deep breaths. We should get the fuck out of here. I rubbed my eyes, trying to get the fatigue to settle so I could comprehend the magnitude of what he was saying. For context, my friends and I had booked an Airbnb near the mountains for the weekend. Hike and then drink. Get our minds off of work and school. I had been super tired after hiking, so I'd taken a nap. I shook my head. You went down into the basement? I asked. We weren't supposed to, and they told us not to. Yeah, dude, I know, Chris continued. But I did it anyway, and I saw people down there. We need to fucking leave ASAP. What kind of people? I asked, pretty much fully awake now. You mean the owners of this place? They came back? Chris shook his head. No, not them. Weird looking people. Creepy ass fucking people. I sat up, thinking that maybe Chris had taken some of the LSD we'd been saving for the next day. Fuck, dude, relax, I told him. Explain exactly what you saw. He laid it out pretty concisely. Despite the fact that the people who had posted the listing had explicitly told us not to go down there, Chris had gotten drunk, gotten curious, and went down there. To his surprise, the door had been unlocked. He couldn't find the light switch, but there was just enough of it coming through the windows for him to be able to make his way down the stairs. Arriving at the bottom, he allowed his eyes a few seconds to readjust. And right in front of him, he could see a small table with about 6 people sitting around it, their outlines illustrated by the afternoon light. At first, his brain rationalized it as large dolls or puppets that had been placed there, but he continued looking at them, and eventually one of them turned their heads to face him. He didn't stick around after that, and shot up the stairs, shutting the door behind him. As he told me this, I kind of didn't want to believe him, but there was also absolutely no reason why he'd be lying. He just wasn't that type of guy. Coupled with the genuine fear on his face, I began leaning towards the idea that he was telling the truth and that there actually were a bunch of people sitting silent at a table in the darkness of the basement. I got up and looked out the bedroom windows, seeing Jay and Paul standing on the front porch, grilling burgers. Then I looked back at Chris. If you're telling the truth, we need to call the people who own this place. I tried, he said. They didn't pick up. I've sent them texts as well. I shook my head. So what? You think they're dangerous? Should we call the cops? Chris shrugged. I don't know, he said. I don't know if they're dangerous, but they are as fuck didn't look right, and I want to get out of here. For a while, we stared at each other, the general silence of the house becoming progressively more ominous. After a while, I sighed. Yeah, let's get out of here. We grabbed our phones, wallets, the car keys, and moved down the stairs, out of the house as fast as we could. Jay and Paul were laughing, holding beers as we approached them. Paul turned around, pointing a greasy spatula towards us. You guys hungry or what? He asked. Chris began telling them what he'd seen, but it was obvious that they were more than a few drinks deep and not taking anything he was saying seriously. Dude, it sounds like you're fucking tripping, Jay said. Are you sure you're not tripping? I'm being serious, Chris said. I swear to fucking God, I'm serious. We need to get out of here now. Well, I'm about 5 beers in, so I ain't driving, Jay said. And I sure as hell ain't letting any of you drive my truck either. Are you sure you weren't just seeing shit? Fine. I'm walking then, Chris said. I'm not staying here. Look, I'll go down there and talk to them, Paul said, half joking. See what the hell they want. Jay laughed as sheer disbelief washed over Chris's face. I'm not bullshitting, man, he said. I'm not. Yeah, I believe you, Paul said dismissively. I'll go and see what's up. Chris continued to protest, but Paul wouldn't budge, and soon he was inside the house, making his way towards the basement. Chris shook his head, his eyes wide, nearly bulging out of his head at this point. Fuck this, he yelled, seeming to grow more agitated by the second. I fucking warned you. Before we could say anything else, he bolted, sprinting like a bat out of hell towards the woods. We tried chasing after him, but couldn't come close to matching his pace. We stopped, panting for air as we watched him disappear into the trees. What the fuck? Jay asked. Is he being serious? I thought it was a joke. I shook my head. Let's go check on Paul. We ran back to the house, entering to see the basement door wide open. The place was completely silent, but before I could call out, I could hear somebody moving up the stairs. I backed up, unsure of what to expect, how to react, when Paul came out of the darkness, looking somewhat bewildered. He looked at us and shook his head. This is freaky, man, he said. Was he being for real? Jay asked. There's people down there? Not exactly. The 3 of us went down there with my nerves yet to be completely settled. We couldn't find a light switch, but there were enough windows and enough daylight for us to move around. Turns out, Chris hadn't been totally correct, but he probably hadn't been lying either. Planted right in front of the stairs was a table with 3 chairs. Sitting in those 3 chairs were some of the most lifelike sculptures I'd ever seen. 2 soldiers in what appeared to be old military outfits and a woman in some kind of long religious dress. They weren't quite enough to be uncanny. If you looked at them for more than a few seconds, you could tell that they were carved from stone and then meticulously painted, something you could confirm by touching them. Still, they were exceptionally crafted, something that could have only been achieved by a dedicated professional. I mean, I don't blame him, Paul said, referring to Chris. I almost shat bricks when I first saw them. I mean, what the fuck? I remember back to the conversation I'd had with him, how he'd claimed that one of them actually looked at him and then a shiver ran down my spine. Jay laughed, a palpable relief in his voice. How much do you think we could sell these for? I'm down to take them and find out, Paul joked. On the surface, it made enough sense. The homeowners were in possession of some very valuable items they stored in the basement, simply forgetting to lock it this time. Jay and Paul continued looking at them, taking pictures, marveling at how weird it all was. On the other hand, I wasn't so keen on doing so. I wanted to get the hell out of the basement ASAP. The details just weren't adding up. I knew Chris well. If the only thing he'd seen had been these statues, he would not have reacted the way he did. Jay was looking at his phone, smiling at the pictures he'd taken, when suddenly his expression dropped. He put his phone down and looked ahead. There's another one over there, he said, in the corner. What do you mean? Paul asked, looking closely at one of the soldiers' rifles. Another statue in the corner. Paul looked up and looked towards where Jay was pointing. Oh, he said. Yeah, I see it. The two of them continued to look at it, but showed no indication of wanting to explore it. Instead, they stood still, their expressions slowly being taken over by a look of deep unease. Eventually, I looked as well. It did appear to be a statue, something tucked away in one of the dark corners. It was tall, extremely so, maybe 7 feet, its head well eclipsing the top of one of the bookshelves. Its bottom half was completely obscured, but from what the light was revealing, it was wearing some kind of helmet, like one of those steel ones soldiers were equipped with back in World War I. There came a point as my eyes were adjusting to the darkness where a pit began to form in my stomach. Its features were slowly revealing themselves, and it almost looked as if it were twitching. I thought that maybe it was just the darkness playing tricks until I saw it blink. Clear as day, it blinked. I guess the other two saw the same thing because we were practically trampling each other running up the stairs. We slammed the door shut behind us before quickly pushing one of the couches in front of it. Paul and I were halfway out the front door, but Jay was still inside the house. What the hell are you doing? Paul yelled at him. Come on, I need my laptop, Jay said before throwing Paul his keys. I'll be quick, start the truck. He ran up the stairs where Paul continued to curse at him. Really, dude? Are you fucking serious? And then I remembered my own laptop, thinking about how annoying it would be if I were to lose it. I looked at the basement door, then at the stairs, then at Paul. It's gonna take 5 seconds, I said. I could hear him cursing behind me as I ran, jumping 3 steps at a time until I reached my room, darting in and grabbing my laptop from the desk. As I rushed out of there, I saw that the door to Jay's room was shut. I stopped, slowed my breathing. I was almost certain that he hadn't gone back downstairs. I would have seen or heard from him. I approached the door. Jay? I asked. The hell are you doing? No response. I looked at the door, but every muscle was frozen, almost as if my body were warning me not to go in. Suddenly it creaked open just slightly and I jumped back. Jay? I asked. Still no response. I couldn't see anything through the crack until my eyes drifted upwards near the ceiling. A pair of eyes looking down at me. Large eyes set too far apart on a face with skin that was too pale. I turned and bolted back downstairs as I heard the door swing open the rest of the way. Of course, I didn't look back and ran outside and jumped into the passenger seat of the truck. Where is he? Paul asked. Just fucking drive, I told him. He didn't protest and stepped on the gas, ripping down the dirt road. We continued driving until we reached a rest stop, the first with other people. By that point, we had both called and messaged the homeowners about a dozen times each. Nothing but radio silence on the other end. We even noticed that the listing itself had been removed from Airbnb entirely. And then we called the police. Somebody answered and I explained the situation as in-depth as I could. The operator listened without interrupting, waited a few seconds, and then asked me for the address. I told it to her. Another bout of silence elapsed before she hung up. After arriving back in the city, we considered reporting it again, but neither of us felt the nerve to do so. We also haven't heard from Chris. We've gone to his apartment and knocked on his door, but nobody answers. I tried to do some research on the place, Googling the cabin's address. One result came up, a website that appeared to consist solely of an album of black and white images of soldiers standing in various places, with dates and addresses written beneath them in small text. I Control-F'd and found the address I was looking for. The accompanying photo was of a tall soldier, holding a blood-stained hatchet and standing in a clearing surrounded by trees, with the outline of a cabin behind him. The man's skin was pale, his eyes oddly large and set so wide apart that it just didn't look right. There were also 2 dates attached to it, August 17th, 1915, and the date that we had arrived at the cabin. It's been almost a week removed from the incident that Paul and I have both made a mutual decision to drop it, to try and go back to our ordinary lives. But it's been difficult. I keep expecting to receive a phone call from the cops, asking me questions about Chris and Jay, where I'd seen them last. Those guys have family. They probably knew where they were headed and who they'd gone with. And yet, nobody's reaching out. It doesn't feel like we're out of the clear here. It doesn't feel like this is over at all. My house is empty, but my friend, who is deaf and blind, insists someone is here. They say seeing is believing, but if I'd followed that advice, I'd be dead now. It was a deaf, blind friend who first told me there was someone in the house with me. I scoffed. I didn't believe him. I looked out across the wide open, empty living room. I looked upstairs in the den and spare bedroom and out of the patio and in the kitchen. It was just the 2 of us. But my friend Will insisted, while he was sitting on the base of the stairs, tracing his fingers along the ornate sculpted banister. I went upstairs to grab something from the den. He felt another set of footsteps on the stairs after mine, following me up. He told me afterward in sign language when we sat down at the table for tea. Then he asked me who else was here. I chuckled, my fingers tickling his leg in laughter, and told him he must have imagined it. But he claimed he could smell someone. When I asked him to describe the smell, he said it smelled bad, a sort of garbage smell, someone who needed a bath or hung out in trash. Maybe my trash needed to go out, I said, and insisted it was just us. Are you sure? He and I were supposed to be working on the script for a game we were developing together, but he interrupted my suggestions to exclaim, "There! Do you smell it?" I didn't smell a thing, nor did I see anyone in the living room with us. Does your nose actually work, or is it just a decoration on your face? Will burst, exasperated. When I dropped him off back at his apartment later after we'd finished our work together, as he was getting out of the car, he warned me again that I definitely have another person hiding somewhere in my home. His hands described the feel to me, 2 fingers of his right hand walking up my arm toward my shoulder, 2 fingers of his left following behind, softer. Then he tapped his hand along my arm, showing me the feel of the vibration. First, heavier, more solid, my steps, and then lighter, but still palpable, the second set of steps following mine and vibrating the wooden stairs. I patted his arm in affirmation and told him I'd search the house when I got home. "Be careful," he said, his signing emphatically slow, and gave my arm a final squeeze before tapping his way to the front of his building with his white cane. As soon as I got home, I searched the house, but I couldn't imagine where an intruder might conceal themselves. It was a cozy home, 2 levels with small square footage. The rent was suspiciously low, but I chalked that up to the lack of AC, creaky pipes, and the age of the place. I looked under the sink, in the closet, and the cupboards, in the spare bedroom. I even bought a camera and set it up, but all I captured overnight was myself sleepwalking. I vaguely remembered waking on the staircase and returning to bed. Other than that, the motion capture didn't turn on. According to the video, I was alone in my house. Still, the next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. It said that if you lose one sense, your others become sharper to compensate, but what if the reverse is also true? Was my reliance on my eyes causing my brain to shut out my other senses? What if I tried closing my eyes? It seemed silly. Even so, on a whim, that evening I went around the house wearing a blindfold. I was feeling my way through the kitchen, filling a glass with water from the sink when I felt, the presence of someone. I couldn't pinpoint why. I just had the sense of not being alone. The hairs on my neck rose, and suddenly I was absolutely certain someone was coming up behind me. I snatched off my blindfold. Just me. Still, the feeling lingered for a moment, those goosebumps persisting on my arms. I put the blindfold back on and puttered around in the kitchen for a while. It was then I noticed the smell, like rotten meat, like unwashed flesh, spoiled and awful, and it was so faint, just wafting occasionally. The hairs on the nape of my neck stood up. I went upstairs trying to follow the smell, but I lost it almost immediately when I went into my den. I came back downstairs, my fingers lightly tracing the wall. Thud, thud, thud. I stopped because I felt footsteps behind me. Felt the soft reverberation on the wooden staircase, just a beat after my own. It was just like Will had described to me. Someone was here, right behind me. I felt cold breath on my ear. I tore off the blindfold and whirled around. The staircase was empty. That night, as I lay in bed, I had trouble drifting to sleep. I was afraid of what might happen overnight, and sure enough, I woke up on the stairs sleepwalking. But instead of returning to bed, I tried to keep myself in that dreamy state, and I held my eyes closed. My arm was cold. It took me a moment to realize that someone was holding my hand, a touch of icy fingers drawing me forward, those dead fingers leading me up the stairs. Every instinct told me to tear my hand away and run, but I felt the dead hand guide me up until I was on the landing. The rotten smell made my eyes water as the door to the spare bedroom opened. An overwhelming sense of dread made it hard to breathe as the hand guided me across the room. Then, my fingers touched the cool handle to the balcony door and pushed the door open, fresh air gusting around me. I yanked back, terror shooting through me, and rushed for the light switch. I was alone again. I'm now looking for a new place to live. Will is right. I'm not alone, and my life is in danger every night I stay here. I've got to get out as soon as I can, but my budget is tight and housing is scarce in this area. So until I find a place, I've installed a bolt on the balcony doors and moved a heavy bookshelf in front of them, and I've locked that spare bedroom. You see, I did some research and found out that the tenant who lived here before me died by hanging himself from the balcony of the upstairs bedroom. Before him, there was an old woman who lived here with her daughter, and the daughter was also found hanging. In fact, I don't know how many people before me have died here, seemingly by taking their own lives. The house is not reported to be haunted because no one has ever seen a ghost here, but every day I feel someone in the house with me, their footsteps treading just behind mine. And every day, those dead fingers take my hand and try to lead me out to the balcony. I think I'm in a town that doesn't exist. I need urgent help. I think I'm in a town that doesn't exist. I will do my best to explain with clarity. My name is Roger. I'm a cop. I was recently restationed to a small farming town. I thought since it would probably be less eventful than the city, I would have more times to pursue things I neglected for the majority of my life. However, that's not what happened. Upon my arrival at the station, everything was fine. Meeting my new colleagues, I learned almost everyone came from out of town like me. It was nice to know everyone could relate to me. The first day was uneventful, so to cure my boredom, I made the mistake of reading some old case files. I thought I was reading an elaborate prank. Calls describing impossible problems, monsters, and flying spines. I thought they were not cross-checked, so some officers decided to practice their writing skills. But the details were meticulous, vast, with real and signed resident accounts. I sent a complaint to the station's higher-ups. The station's higher-ups were confused at my complaint and gave a speech about how they ensure standards are kept high in the station. Speaking to my new colleagues, I received similar reactions, as if I was explaining to them how it's weird that it's dark during nighttime. I didn't know what to think at first. I thought maybe since I'm the new guy, the station was just messing with me. However, I saw it with my very own eyes. My next-door neighbor and his house vanished within about 5 hours. It was replaced with a patch of grass dominated by a colossal tree. A whole 2-story house disappeared in just 5 hours, replaced by an old oak a few decades old. Talking to my other neighbors about it filled me with extensive paranoia. I never thought a confused look would fill me with dread. I like to consider myself intelligent, so I rather quickly realized something is wrong with the place. I collected all the evidence I could to send to my old station, including some interviews I did with some of the officers who had weirder calls. I wanted to get their unprofessional retelling of events, their off-the-record point of view. I sent off the first few to my old station with no response coming back. In fact, nobody from the outside responded. I tried calling everyone from friends, family, and even old colleagues. It seemed I had access to the outside world, but the outside world didn't have access to me. Honestly, I began to question my own sanity. I mean, there are signs. Outbursts of emotion, foggy memory, and hallucinations. I think that's the best way to describe them. Oh, which reminded me, I don't seem to recollect how I got into the town. I got here, but if I drove here or flew, I don't remember. On top of that, a quick Google search showed me the place I'm in doesn't exist. Satellite images show just a thick forest directly where I stand. Standing directly next to my new little house on the phone, I only see trees. I'm unsure of what my next move should be, so I decided to post this here. Hopefully someone will read the first interview and tell me that this is not normal. I need confirmation that I'm not losing my mind. I transcribed the interview below. August 9th, 2024. 1:34 p.m. Rowoak Police Station. Interviewee, Jack Murrow. R. And the recorder is on. How are you feeling, Jack? J. Good. How can I not be? I'm getting paid to do my favorite thing, talking. R. Alright, as you know, I found out that some of the records were, let's say, poorly kept. So I'm gonna ask a few questions about one of your calls just to fill in the missing details. J. No problem. R. Tell me about the call you had a few days ago at midnight. The one in Maggie's. J. Just some kids broke into the store, I guess. Played some tricks on me too. Really, that one had missing details? It was pretty uneventful. Not like there were many details in the first place. R. Yes, that one. Just talk to me. Step by step, what happened that night? J. Alright, big boss. I think it was just about 5 minutes past midnight. I was cruising down the main road on my unexpected night shift. I wasn't supposed to be there that night. Anthony called in sick a day before. Ruined my Friday plans. Sadly, I don't get paid to complain, so I did my job. I remember it was rather cold that night. The breeze snuck into the cruiser at some points, revealing my breath. I didn't shut the windows completely as the echo of the outside wind brushing against the thick tree line brought comfort in the darkness. So did the quiet talk host blabbering on the radio about some new internet trend. The combination of those kept me awake for the midnight shift. The midnight shift is more of a formality than a need. I was on it a few times before and nothing ever happened apart from the occasional checkups on my walkie-talkie. After dark, all business shut. The trees became filled with emptiness and the roads with occasional plastic bags dragged by the wind. Safe to say, when my walkie-talkie told me there is a potential robbery in Maggie's, my pupils grew. It took me less than a minute to arrive at the scene, empty streets and all. The owner was outside, eagerly awaiting my arrival. He rushed towards me before I even had the chance to take a step outside my cruiser. I caught him! I finally caught the fuckers! His words gripped my collar and snatched me closer as he shouted his achievements at me. Slow down, sir, what is going on and what do you mean you caught? Every single night, clothes began disappearing and mannequins were placed in random corners around the shop. 2 days ago, I even found the back door wide open. You guys didn't take me seriously, so I took matters into my own hands. And I caught them. The owner spoke fast in an aggressive farmer's manner as if I was the nuisance, and not the apparent burglar in the shop. I remember a few days ago, some of the boys did visit Maggie's on multiple occasions, yet, like suggested, they didn't find anything of note, apart from the fact that the memory kept in the back room safe was never touched. Please, sir, listen to me, slow down. Tell me, what do you mean you took matters into your own hands? Alright, I bought motion sensors and upgraded the doors. The sensors went off a few minutes ago and the shutters dropped. The owner responded. His slowed down tone gave me the time to finally get a good look at him. He was an older gentleman with a thick whitened beard and a protruding bald spot. He certainly didn't look like the owner of a clothes shop. His jacket and jeans were rugged, wore out. I'm guessing he did the finances while his wife did the clothing part. So the burglar is still inside? I asked, while peeking behind his shoulder onto Maggie's. It was a brick rectangle with metal shutters protecting the front door. A giant sign above the shutters glowed and sparkled in my car's headlights. It read, Maggie's, clothes fit for all the seasons. Oh, they are, and I want you to arrest them and tell them to leave my mannequins alone. His saliva polished my boot. I reached over to my walkie-talkie and lined out the situation. While the owner was preparing to open the shutter doors, I got the grim news that no backup would be coming. I doubted that the burglar would be armed or dangerous due to their recent non-violent history. However, the fear of an altercation was still eating at me. My flashlight failed to reach the back of the store, slowly cutting off at the midpoint right at the rotating clothing racks. I couldn't see any movement in the gloom, a good, yet bad sign. Hello? This is the police. We surrounded the building. Make it easy for us and come out slowly with your hands up. I heard my own routine spoken right back at me. I was quite startled even though I knew it was just an echo. I'm afraid that the light switch is in the storeroom right at the back of the store. We can enter it through the back door. With no hesitation, I shut the front door and marched onward towards the back entrance. The owner fiddled with his mass of keys until one eventually fit. Take a few steps back, sir. I gently slid my arm onto the owner's shoulder and pushed him away from the door. I grasped the metallic handle, slowly turning the knob while trying to control my racing heartbeat. I felt my wrist tense as the door refused to pop open, even though I turned the knob a solid 85 degrees. After a deep breath and a quick snap, the back door was open. My flashlight lit the concrete gray staff room. Compared to the actual store, it featured no aesthetics nor color. It was just a formality. A quick glimpse showed that the door leading to the store was closed, but I still had to check if he wasn't here instead. Each step created a loud thud that echoed throughout the room. My flashlight following my panning head showed the room was empty. The room was rather small, only featuring an old sofa, table with a dusty computer, fuse box, and a bunch of clothing racks doing their best to hide the blandness of the walls. "Nobody's here, come in!" The owner in an instant rushed towards the fuse box while mumbling to himself. He flicked some switches until the staff room exploded with a bright light. The sound of multiple lights springing to life and the corresponding buzz filled the orchestra. "There we go, let me get the computer, I've got some cameras we can look at." The owner rushed to the bright monitor while I reached over to my walkie-talkie to report. The staff walls were full of framed pictures, some showing the Maggie family while others showing the black and white beginning of the family-run business. Upon closer inspection, I noticed some photos of a young girl. I never saw her in the shop nor near the owners, but she was in most of the photos. She would either hug the owner's hip or walk around the shop, browsing clothes while giggling to herself. A portrait of her with a golden frame had a cross sit right above it. "This little fuck." The owner grit his teeth in frustration. I almost forgot he was in the room to begin with. I ran over to him to see what was happening, and that's when I saw the CCTV. Saw exactly what was behind the walls on my right. Saw exactly what the burglar prepared for us. The shop was filled to the brim with clothes. The walls had a nice oak look to them, and the floors were white as kitchen tiles. However, the burglar was nowhere to be seen. The only things we saw were the mannequins. They were not in their usual place. They were all around the shop, some holding clothes while others simply browsing the clothing racks. The clothes they wore did not match. Some wore socks as gloves and others shirts as scarves. All around the shop, they were put in places to mimic customers shopping. Some even mimicked staff, one on the till and another sweeping the floor. The longer I looked, the more details I noticed, like some mannequins even appeared to act like children. On their knees, holding hands or being lifted by another, they cling to their chosen parent. I thought maybe the burglar wasn't alone to set up this many mannequins in their wardrobes. It would have taken hours. But there was no burglar, at least on the CCTV. I considered the chance of him hiding between the clothing racks or inside a fort made from a pile of clothes. The problem was the cameras had no blind spots. You could see every inch on the pixelated monitor. The longer I stared at that screen, the less they resembled mannequins. Panic caused me to be irrational. I decided to search for him myself. I rushed over to the door, mumbling, convincing myself it was just some kids. Unarmed, not dangerous kids. "What you doing?" The owner jumped out of his seat, landing in almost a sprint position. "I'll find him. I don't want to stay here all night. If you see him on the camera, shout." A steady push was all it took to enter a bigger space, with much less room. On the CCTV, this place looked spacious. In person, it felt crowded. Air was replaced with the stench of leather and cloth, while the whole shop was filled with unconventional shoppers. Getting closer to the nearest mannequin filled me with a weird feeling. I felt that if I continued, I would bump into a person, a certain aura that was pushing me away from them. But at the same time, no matter how many steps back I took, that feeling followed. It held a wet broomstick. Slightly hunched over, it swept the floor. It wore a backwards Nike cap with a winter jacket tied around its waist. Like a belt or improvised dress. There were a lot of mannequins in the store on second thought, an unreasonable amount. There were more mannequins than mannequin stands, not enough space in the store nor staff room. They covered each aisle, corner, and wall. Traversing through the thick plastic jungle was difficult. It only made the feeling grow, especially around tight turns. Finally turning to my side, I did my best not to touch any of them. The closer I was, the more my lungs begged for air and skin for sweat. It felt like they were strategically placed to hinder my movements, almost perfectly replicating a busy day. I walked in circles, checked every hiding spot. Nobody was here, except for the mannequins, of course. I stopped and sighed in a sign of defeat. I was ready to call it quits, ready to tell the owner what my colleagues have been telling him for the past few weeks, when a child caught my eye. Or, well, a mannequin acting like a child. On its knees, it held another mannequin's hands while wearing an extremely undersized pink shirt. It stared into a mirror. However, for some reason, I felt something was off. I didn't understand it at the time. It looked just like all the other mannequins, from size to attire, but it just felt different. Only then I realized it was staring at me through the reflection in the mirror. Only then the loud humbuzz stopped and all the lights shut in the store. "Jesus, why'd you turn off the lights?" I shouted in pitch blackness towards the staff room. My own voice echoed back to me. After a few seconds, like a hit of adrenaline, I woke up from my fear-infused trance and scrambled to find my flashlight. I didn't even bother to unclip it from my belt. With an aggressive yank, I freed it and lit up the room. Quickly scanning every wall and corner for movements, I found nothing. All the mannequins. Their clothes left on the floor in their place. More than 40 of them. I was alone in pitch darkness. Alone in dead quiet. Each step felt heavy and cumbered. No longer blocked by the mannequins, I carefully stepped around the multiple piles of clothes left behind by them. Each step a loud, echoey thud, I crept closer and closer to the staff room. The entrance to the staff room, my exit, was slightly open, only barely enough to see the darkness spilling out of it. I was just close enough to reach for the door handle. I could almost touch the handle, my fingers almost touching the metal exterior. But I felt that feeling again, as if I'm too close to someone and need to take a few steps back to avoid a head collision. So I reached my hand back. However, the feeling wasn't coming from in front of me. I panned my flashlight slowly to get one last look at the shop. All the mannequins stood in the middle of the shop. Without their clothes, their white skin reflected my flashlight rays. They looked like a mass, blended together, only their unlit numerous limbs could be distinguished. As a monstrum, it stood at a distance. A pile of blended plastic awaited my next move. Stared at me with numerous heads. A sturdy pull and sprint, I was back at my cruiser. While running out, the owner was nowhere to be seen. Contacting the station the next day, we ran a full investigation. The owner apparently saw someone wearing shop clothing running out of the store, so we sprinted after him, explaining his absence. When that happened, another burglar or kid or whatever shut the lights to play a trick on me. We couldn't catch the kid and the mannequins were gone by the morning. All the money was left in the shop, but multiple clothing and of course the mannequins were stolen. Good news, however. Since then, there have been no new calls from Maggie's. The kids had enough. End of transcript. I work at one of the last stores left in a nearly abandoned mall. I closed on my own last night, and I hope I never have to do so again. We aren't the only store left in the mall. There's about 6 small shops total, but they are all spread out along the different spokes of this wagon wheel-shaped mall. We're the only one in this section. Oftentimes, the other stores close early. Considering the lack of foot traffic, I don't blame them. We can go an entire night without seeing a single customer at times, so I know it's only a matter of time before our store shuts down for good, too. I never closed before, but my coworker Britt had told me that after dark, with most storefronts barred and unlit, not another person in sight, it almost felt like you were alone in the world. I was relieved that she was going to be there with me tonight. Her peppiness was contagious, and at least I wouldn't be by myself, staring into the dark expanse where the old Macy's used to be. The only thing is, Britt never came in. She no-call no-showed, which she had never done before. I was so worried that I called our manager Chris, but his exact response was, "No one wants to work these days. You can close alone. It's fine." He stopped by to drop off the extra gate key, muttering about work ethic the entire time. I bit my tongue at that. I know Britt, and that money is tight. She worked her ass off, and she'd never just miss work without a good reason. And even then, I was confident she would have at least let us know. So that's how I ended up where I am now. Knees pulled to my chest, phone on silent, screen brightness turned down, waiting for the sun to come up. Not alone. I wish I were. I'm banking on whatever is out there being averse to sunlight since it's so pale, almost translucent. So how did I end up here, you ask? We hadn't had a customer in 2 hours, and the mall had descended into a level of darkness that surprised me. No wonder we got very little business after dark. From the road, I bet the whole mall looks like it's abandoned. I wished we'd had some sort of music playing, but the sound system, like most things in this place, is broken. I occupied myself by dusting and prepping everything for the next morning. It was both a good way to prepare for the approaching end of my shift and to distract myself while making a bit of noise in the process. Something, anything, to cut through the thick silence. Eventually, I stepped out of the store and closed the gate so I could take a quick bathroom break. I'd written up a "Be Right Back" sign to stick, but I doubted it'd be seen by any eyes other than my own. The green exit sign flickered at me before it surrendered to the darkness. The only sounds I could hear were the buzzing of the struggling sign, my own footsteps, echoing through the massive empty space. I jumped as, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a pale figure behind the glass of one of those closed stores. I turned sharply, but it looked to be an old mannequin, illuminated by the scant neon sign coming from the distant and empty food court. No thanks, I thought to myself as I speed walked towards my destination. Why do mall bathrooms always have to be at the end of such long hallways? I suddenly wished I had brought my phone with me just to have the light, something so I wouldn't be walking into pitch blackness at the end of the hallway. The inside of the bathroom was nice and bright at least, but as soon as I entered the stall, a hoarse whisper from the other side of the door nearly made me jump. "Please, I'm scared." "What?" I whispered back, nervously. Silence. When I went to wash my hands, I noticed that all the stalls were open. It was so quiet, I never heard anyone enter or leave. I thought I heard a choked sob from behind me, but chalked it up to overactive imagination. The one downside of the bathroom being so well illuminated was that it made the hallway feel even more eerie once I entered back into the darkness. As I was nearly at the end of the hallway, finally approaching the dim light, I jumped as I heard a door open and close behind me. I laughed nervously as I reminded myself that the mall wasn't actually abandoned. Not yet, at least. So a customer emerging from the restroom was not a supernatural event. What was concerning, though, was how they filled the hallway with a pungent stench, like someone had died and spent days baking in the summer heat. That's when I remembered that the men's room was down a different hallway. There hadn't been anyone else in the women's room with me. I tried not to gag or betray my fear by looking over my shoulder. It sounded like they were struggling to breathe as they pursued me, their slow, measured breaths wheezing and rattling. I quickened my pace. As I passed by, I instinctively glanced back at the storefront with the mannequin that had scared the ever-living crap out of me earlier. The store was empty. Nope, I thought, as I sprinted back to my store. That now familiar wheezing with a sort of draggling shuffle added in echoed through the dark space behind me. I struggled with the gate because my hands were shaking, but I finally got it open, just enough for me to slide underneath. I felt infinitely better after I'd locked the gate behind me. I was drumming my fingers on the counter, nervously, when I noticed that they were dirty. A flaky maroon covered my fingers and palms, patterned as if it had come from the gate. Sure enough, when I checked, that was the source. Splattered in some areas, smeared in others. Although it didn't look fresh, I could still detect a faint telltale copper scent. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't blood, and even if it were, there was a perfectly logical explanation. I went to the back to look for paper towels. I was not going back to the bathroom. I'd been back there for a bit and had, for the most part, regained my composure. Told myself I'd imagined what I'd encountered in the hallway. When I heard what sounded like someone shaking the gate, I sighed. Seemed like we did have a customer after all. There was no one there by the time I dodged boxes and supplies and made it to the front. If they called and complained to Chris, I knew I'd never hear the end of it. I did feel guilty, too. I always strive to provide great customer service. I was just so unnerved that I was off my game. "Hey, I'm sorry, we're open," I called out softly to the darkness beyond the gate. Silence was the response, although I thought I heard that faint rattling wheeze again. I craned my neck, angled my body so I could see further down the corridor. I could make out the pale, tall figure of a mannequin in the distance inside. I assumed that someone from one of the other stores, who likely also had far too much time on their hands, was pranking me. But the longer I stared at it, illuminated by the distant purple neon lights from the food court, I realized that its arms and legs were too long. Its torso was too short to resemble any mannequin I had ever seen. Pale arms ended in long-fingered hands, dark, stained. The exit sign it was standing under chose that moment to feebly attempt to flicker back to light. Flash, flash, flash. With each flicker of the weak green light, I got a better, brief look at its face while it seemed to be focusing on something off to the side. I could make out slits for a nose and a long, wide mouth, smeared with something. No eyes, just smooth, pellucid flesh where they should have been. I jumped back and let out a gasp. In my haste, I accidentally rattled the gate loudly. Its head instantly jerked in my direction. Shit. With each flicker, it was just a bit closer. I ran back and did my best to jump and clear the counter, but instead hung my foot and loudly crashed into the display behind it. My khakis were torn, and I'd left a small trail of blood. I just know Chris is never going to let me hear the end of it for knocking the display over and bleeding on the merchandise. I can't see it, but I know that thing is still standing there because every so often I hear its wheezing, low, guttural coming from directly outside the gate, or the sound of long, thin fingers scraping down the metal bars. Maybe Britt didn't no call no show after all. Maybe she never left the mall after she locked up last night. I know I'm not going home tonight. I'm waiting here until the sun comes up. Oh, and I'm never closing again. My wife found something strange while we were camping, and she refuses to put it down. Apologies in advance for any typos or grammatical errors. I'm typing this on my phone with my non-dominant hand. Everything happened so recently. It's still so vivid in my mind. My wife, Fallon, had never been camping before, and we decided to go together for our 5-year wedding anniversary. It probably doesn't sound like the most glorious vacation, but we love the outdoors and we figured it'd be a good break from our desk jobs. The first couple of days we hiked, watched the stars, and relaxed together. We live in the middle of the city, so we enjoyed seeing the tall blue spruces, the mountains, and smelling the fresh air. It was the perfect trip, at first. Things started to go downhill today, the day before we planned on leaving. We decided to start our hike on a trail we had walked before and immensely enjoyed, planning to choose a different fork this time. We were taking in the sights. We started discussing moving out of the city so we could do things like this more often. We both worked from home, so it was a very real possibility, and we were engrossed in our conversation on the logistics of such a thing that it took us about 20 minutes to realize we hadn't hit the fork in the trail yet. That didn't seem right, so I pulled out the map, which indicated we should have already passed the hard-to-miss Y-shape. It had been a couple of days since our first trek on that trail, so we figured we just got disoriented and ended up on a different one. It was a pleasant walk and seemed straightforward enough, so we figured we'd keep going and that at least we could easily find our way back. We kept going, enjoying the soft breeze and the smell of pines it brought with it. We walked on in silence, listening to the rustling of the wind in the trees and occasional sound of small animals stepping through the brush. We heard the rushing water of the stream before we saw it. It wasn't very wide, less than 4 feet, but the way the water moved, I guess it was far deeper than it looked. I tossed a small twig in out of curiosity, which was whisked away quickly. Fallon nudged me, pointed out that the stream didn't show up on the map at all. We wondered if we had accidentally left the boundaries of the park. The trail looked well-worn and safe. It wasn't as if we were wandering off into uncharted wilderness, so we decided to continue on and just hoped we weren't trespassing. Due to the width of the stream, I just stepped over and put my hand out to help Fallon, but by the time I turned to where she had been standing, she had already cleared the distance in a graceful jump. "Show off," I teased. She stuck her tongue out at me. Fallon seemed fascinated by the sudden change in our surroundings once we'd crossed over, while I was unnerved by the new look the forest had taken on. The trees were older, tall, gnarled, and as their density and height increased, the amount of light seeping in through the canopy decreased drastically. Still, the trail continued on. The soft black dirt sank slightly as we walked. The smell of something sour had replaced the fresh scent of pine. I don't remember when this silence began. Was it after the stream or before? I only noticed it when a light mist set in and Fallon disappeared. I jumped. She had snuck behind me and whispered in my ear. This would be the perfect setting for something to pop out of the woods and drag us away screaming. I laughed, my fear a bit at the ridiculousness of the idea. Yeah, that'd make for one hell of an anniversary. It was only after we stopped speaking and the silence returned in stark contrast that I realized we hadn't heard a single sound other than our own steps and breaths in a while. The silence from the forest seemed to confirm the sense of emptiness around us. We eventually came to an area where the trees and grass abruptly ended, framing a small lake. The abrupt difference in the light between the dark, shadowy forest and the bright clearing had us blinking at the sudden return of the sun. The lake looked more like a crater in the black soil than water, until a gentle breeze created waves across its dark surface. Oddly, despite the brightness of the sun, there was no reflection. Fallon, who is terrified of deep water, inhaled sharply, stepped backwards instinctively. I hadn't seen anything like it before and wanted to take a picture. I found it fascinating. There weren't any footprints, human or otherwise, in the soft, dark dirt besides our own. I pulled out my phone and immediately dropped it on the ground. In the brief amount of time it took for me to bend down to retrieve it, wipe the black soil off the screen and lens, and stand it back up, something in the atmosphere had shifted. The air was colder. The sun had been swallowed up by clouds in such a way that what little light shone through had taken on a sickly greenish cast. The water was moving. Ripples emanated from the middle as something disrupted the otherwise calm water. It took a moment to realize that whatever the source of the disturbance was, it was beginning to emerge from the surface. Something about the wrongness of it told me that we should not stick around to see what it was. I backed away, my mouth set in a grim line as I turned around to see if Fallon was seeing the same thing and I wasn't imagining it. She was focused on the lake as well, but with an expression I couldn't quite place at the time. Looking back now, I think adoration describes it best. Something almost human-shaped, but with long and spindly appendages, was arising from the water. The thing was matte black and difficult to distinguish from its surroundings in the low light until it hauled itself further and began to pull itself towards along the ground. I didn't know what it was, but my prey instincts told me I did not want to be here when it fully emerged to find out. The non-rightness of it had my skin crawling. I reached for Fallon's hand, but it slipped through my fingers. She was jogging towards it before I even realized what was happening. And then my wife did something that shocked me. She reached down, helped it the remaining way out of the water and to its feet. She began talking to it quickly, excitedly, and leading it toward me. My brain was still trying to process that turn of events. I wasn't entirely sure what I was witnessing. If I had been alone, I would have bolted in the opposite direction, but I couldn't leave my wife with that thing. I stood frozen in place, poised to dart forward to grab her away from it, but Fallon had draped one of its long, thin appendages over her shoulder. She approached me, holding it as if it were an injured hiking partner. "Jordan," she said, her eyes misty. "This is my roommate, Katie, from college." She patted it on what would have been an arm had it been entirely human-shaped. "Katie, it's been so long," she gestured toward me. "This is my husband, Jordan." I stood there, dumbfounded. I was frozen, my stomach heavy with a sort of fear I can't even find the words to describe, other than the feeling of seeing something human eyes were not meant to see. I know you don't need me to tell you this, but I just want to confirm to you that there was no way in hell that thing was Katie. I had met Katie before, and she was an actual, living, breathing, normal human being. We were even friends on Instagram. According to her recently posted pictures, she was living on Cape Cod, not at the bottom of a lake in the middle of nowhere several states away. When my brain and mouth finally started working again, all I could bring myself to say was, honey, I don't think that's... But before I could even think of how to finish that sentence, I noticed that where the thing had rested upon her shoulder, the delineation of where her body ended and it began seemed less crisp, somehow. I hoped it was a trick of the light, but the observation stirred me out of my stupor. I became more insistent. "Fallon, I need you to get away from that, please. I don't know what you're seeing, but that isn't Katie," I said as calmly as I could. I thought that maybe if I reasoned with her, it would snap her out of whatever delusion she was trapped in. "Please, remember where we are. Why would she be out there? Why would she crawl out of that lake?" She looked at me indignant. "You want me to leave her here on her own? Injured?" I had to rack my brain a bit, but then I did recall a story about how Katie had injured her leg in what would be the first and last time the two of them went skiing. Fallon had to nearly drag her back to the lodge. This had been years and years ago, long before we were even dating. I wondered frantically if she was reliving that moment. I didn't know what to do. She was latched onto the thing like it was her best friend, literally. She looked at me with that fiery determination in her gray eyes that told me there was no convincing her. "All right," I eventually said, warily. It hadn't attacked her or really moved at all since it emerged, and I wanted to get us away from that lake as soon as possible before anything else crawled out of it. I didn't really see any choice but to continue back the way we came. I led us back across the path, the surrounding woods silent enough that I could hear the raspy, rattling sound of the thing's gasping breaths. Every time I glanced over my shoulders, it became harder to tell where Fallon's arms ended and that matte black torso began. I picked up my pace. As we approached the stream, she was having a one-sided conversation with it about a different friend, laughing hysterically as if it had told her a joke. When she caught me staring, she narrowed her eyes at me in response. I squinted as if it had helped me understand what she was seeing, how to help her, but it didn't. I stepped across the rushing water, same as before. I turned to Fallon, unsure of what to do. Against my better judgment, I held out my hand. "I'll get Katie across so you can jump." She ignored me and instead just continued on, putting one foot into the stream as if she hadn't seen it there at all, and it seemed to surprise her because she jolted back before she could have even put her full weight on it and fallen in. She stumbled backwards as if surprised, shook her head like she was desperately trying to awaken from a daydream. "What?" Her annoyed look had instantly changed to one of confusion. "What's happening? How did we get back here already? Where's Katie?" The confusion quickly gave way to fear. The blood drained from her face. She had turned her head and seemed to be seeing the thing draped over her shoulder for what it truly was now. She was just now experiencing the primal terror I had felt when I first saw it emerge from the water. She tried to push it off her violently, panicking, struggling, screaming, shattering the silence. I can't get it off. Her eyes pleaded with me. I jumped back over to help. Jordan, please, she begged, her voice hoarse. I tried to help pull it off of her, but wherever she had touched it, it almost seemed like it had absorbed into her own body. My breathing was frantic. I was trying to tell her it'd be okay, telling her to stay calm, while clearly not doing so myself. After our unsuccessfully fumbling, she suddenly started moving away from me, her eyes full of confusion and fear. The thing, now that it was attached to her fully, it had begun to back away from me and was slowly dragging her with it. Our eyes met as we simultaneously realized where it was taking her. It was headed back towards that dark, placid lake, back to where it had first emerged from. I grabbed her hand, pulled her towards me, putting all my weight into it. Please, Jordan, she sobbed. Her voice croaked. Please don't let it take me. For as thin and fragile as it looked, it was still managing to pull her away from me. Suddenly, the thing relented a little bit, and without its resistance, I fell back into the stream. All three of us were yanked in by the force of my fall and the current. I watched helplessly as she struggled to stay above the water. I'll never forget the look on her face, one of abject terror as the thing pulled her close and she was swept away. When I finally caught onto something along the shore and managed to pull myself up, I was coughing up water. I wasn't sure where I was. My clothes and everything else that hadn't been in our waterproof bag were soaked. The maps were gone, but my first thought was Fallon. I ran, screaming her name as dusk began to settle. Somehow I found her. She was sitting against a tree, hugging herself, her skin pale from the icy water, and eyes wide with shock, but to my immense relief, she was alive, and that awful thing was gone. She looked like her normal self, albeit traumatized a bit. I grabbed her hand, told her that we were okay, that everything was going to be okay. We were both going to make it. We agreed to leave right away and come back for our gear later. We did not want to risk meeting that thing, or anything else like it, while wandering around in the dying light trying to find our campsite. We sprinted back towards the car and had almost reached the lot too before she stopped short. It's funny, for a while, I really did believe we were going to make it, even when she turned sharply, led us back the way we'd come. At first, I'd never felt more relieved to hold her hand in mine. But the thing is, now that she's pulling me back through the dark and dense trees, dragging me along the soft soil, I've realized that I can't let go of it. My sister having an imaginary friend was cute until it wasn't. The teacher knew from the look on my face I had forgotten my homework again. What's your excuse this time, Toby? She asked. I'm sorry, miss. I left it on the kitchen table. I'll have it tomorrow, I promise. She had heard it many times before. It was the same old song and dance, no matter what I said. It didn't stop me from getting detention. When I got home, my mother was waiting for me. The school had already phoned her, and I knew by the look on her face I was in big trouble. This is the third time this month the school rang me. I'm sorry, Mom. I did leave my homework at home. Miss Hinchley is just out to get me. She sent me to my room after she told me I was grounded for the week. I hated being grounded because all I had was my sister, Cindy, to talk to. Mrs. Hinchley gave me detention again. I hate her. I wish somebody would teach her a lesson, I explained to Cindy. Cindy looked at me with a big smile on her face. I can ask my friend to help you. Millie is great and does everything I ask her to do. My sister was annoying, but I found it cute that she had an imaginary friend. Later, I was jolted from my sleep, and Cindy was sitting by the dressing table with her back turned to me. Get back to bed, Cindy. It's late. If Mom finds you out of bed, I'll be in trouble. I hated sharing a room with my sister who slept on the top bunk. When my dad died, we had to move to a smaller house. My mom said it was temporary, but it's been 2 years now, and I'm still stuck in a tiny room with her. When I woke the following morning, my sister was already downstairs. I walked over to the dresser and picked up a drawing my sister must have drawn. My sister's drawings were usually cute. She likes unicorns and fairies, but this one was disturbing. It depicted a woman lying on the floor next to a busted up car, and she had red stuff coming from her head. I arrived at school that day to find Miss Hinchley wasn't behind her desk. Instead, we had a substitute teacher who told us she was filling in after Miss Hinchley was involved in a terrible car accident. It was then I remembered the picture Cindy had drawn. It was just a coincidence, I was sure of it, but I couldn't help feeling guilty. Either way, I wished this on her. The only upside to Miss Hinchley's accident was not having to do detention and go home. On the way home, I bumped into Damian Morsley. He was on my case all year, and every time he saw me, he gave me a beating, and this time was no different. When I got home, all bloody and bruised, I went straight to my room. I didn't want my mother to make a big deal about it. I didn't want to give Damian another reason to hate me. "What happened to you?" my sister asked as she stepped into the room. "Nothing happened to me," I said as I scolded my sister for asking too many questions. "Was it that mean kid Damian again?" she asked in a concerned tone. "Yes, but you can't say anything to Mom. She will go ballistic." My sister looked at me again with that mischievous smile. "Don't worry. Millie will fix him." The next morning, I woke to find another drawing left on the dresser. This picture was even more disturbing than the last. It showed a kid lying on the floor with what appeared to be a knife sticking from his stomach and a man standing over him. For the first time, I was hoping that Damien was in class, but there was no sign of him. As the day went on, rumors started spreading that Damien's father was arrested for doing something terrible to him. On the way home, I decided to take a detour past his house. I was shocked to find his house surrounded by police tape and people in white suits in the garden. A kid on a bike was standing across from the house, and when I asked him what happened, he confirmed my biggest fear, that Damien was murdered by his father. It couldn't be. I refused to believe it, but it happening twice was too much of a coincidence. I ran home and called Cindy up to the bedroom. "Cindy, you need to stop this imaginary friend business. I don't know how you're doing it, but people are getting hurt," I shouted. I could see the tears swell up in her eyes. "But Millie is real. She's not imaginary. You wait and see," she said as she broke down crying before running out of the room. That night, I fell asleep feeling guilty about shouting at my sister. I tossed and turned from a restless sleep before I was jolted awake. My sister was sitting at the dresser again, so I shouted at her to get back into bed, but she ignored me and kept on drawing. "Who are you talking to?" said a voice from above me. Startled, I turned to see my sister still in her bed, but when I turned back, the girl at the dressing table was gone. I walked over to the dresser only to find another drawing. I picked it up and a feeling of dread crept up my spine as I looked at the drawing. It was a picture of someone impaled on spikes, with blood pouring from them at the bottom of a canyon. I feel the blood drained from my body. Tomorrow is our annual school trip to the Grand Canyon. I took my family to a water park. It ruined our lives. "Okay, buddy, we're right here. If you hurry, we can hit the wave pool before we go." I ruffled Will's hair, gave him a little push. He folded his arms, defiant. "The racing slide is the funnest one." "Most fun," I corrected. "And whatever you say, Willie." He nodded with a humph, satisfied, and scurried off. He weaved his way through the molasses of the crowd, splitting families and couples as he homed in on the dilapidated porta-potty. This was one of the few recent attempts Will had dared to use the bathroom all by himself. He was capping a good run, but being out of the house, I kept an eye on the door for any signs of distress. Said it 100 times. I would have noticed anyone coming or going. Maybe 5 seconds I looked away. Was that enough time for him to jump out? And run off in the complete opposite direction? About 5 minutes after he had gone, I got up. I leaned a casual arm against the porta-potty. In a whisper shout over the drone of the few hundred happy pool-goers behind me, "Buddy, it's me. How's it going in there?" There was movement inside, I swear it. I swear it wasn't my imagination. I heard something. I turned and saw my wife, Dippin' Dots in one hand and waving with the other. Can't call it a day at the water park without ice cream. I smiled and wrinkled my nose as a joke. "All right, Will, I'm coming in." The door was unlocked. I made an effort to open it as little as possible and slip inside. I did a double take, turned a full 360, checked the neighboring porta-potty and returned. No, he couldn't have. I peered down past the toilet seat. Log-sized turds floated in the septic stew below. "Will?" I stepped outside and circled the porta-potty. "Will!" I called again. My wife appeared next to me, holding Lila's hand. "What happened? Where's Will?" she asked. I don't know. He was inside." "Lila, did you see him leave at all?" My daughter shook her head, thrusting a spoonful of dots into her mouth. "You were supposed to be watching him," my wife said. "I know." I grabbed the arm of a man nearby. "Excuse me, sir, did you see my son leave this porta-potty here?" I described Will in detail. He saw the desperation in my eyes, but shook his head. "Sorry, try the lifeguard station. I'm sure this happens all the time." He wished us luck and I thanked him. My wife was beginning to cry. She was starting to scare Lila. I ran ahead, cutting through one of the splash pads and hopping the fence to the lifeguard station. "Oh, excuse me, sir." Some acne-riddled teenager with a red and white uniform stood up from behind the desk. My son, I can't find my son. Is there some announcement you can make, something?" The teen closed his eyes. "Yeah, give me 1 sec. I'm kinda new, so I think—" "I don't have a second. If you can't help, then get me a goddamned manager," I snarled. A petite girl, also in high school by the looks of it, turned the corner, oblivious to the nature of the conversation. "Hey, you can't talk to him like that," she pouted. "There's no need to be rude." I stabbed my finger at her, my temper at the end of its wick. "I'll be as rude as I damn well like. Get me a fucking manager or I'll go back there and find one." The police were called, primarily for me. I was screaming, knocking things over, foaming at the mouth, my wife said. The cops said I would have to calm down or they'd handcuff me. They sent out an announcement over the park's PA system. "William, your parents are looking for you at the lifeguard station. If you can find a lifeguard, we can get you back together as soon as possible." "Don't worry," the lifeguard manager said. "We radioed all our employees. He'll be back in no time at all." As it turns out, lost and found children in places like these is fairly common. The problem was, Will never showed up. How do you go home after that? We stayed as long as we could, but it's not like we could sleep on the slides. So the same day I left for the water park with my family, we returned, one short. Lila didn't know what was happening. We told her Will had gotten lost and the police were looking for him. She asked why we weren't looking for him. She began to cry. The funny thing about humans is how simultaneously effective and ineffective we are at lying to ourselves. Because a deep part of yourself, something in your core where you know you can trust it, smells the bullshit. And yet we'll take that lie and run, far as we can, until our legs give out or we crash face first into a wall. After the first day, that piece of me in my core knew I'd never see Will again. But I ran like hell. My lust for closure deflated my marriage like a water balloon with a leak. I was stupid to think I wouldn't get laughed out of the court during custody proceedings. But the one reprieve I had came yesterday. If I couldn't have answers, if I couldn't have my family or my son back, then I'd have some sweet revenge. This last year, I'd been leading media campaigns, doing interviews, degrading myself to what I used to frown on and call an activist, all to destroy the water park that took my son. The park was small, got a lot of bad press in the local outlets where most of their customers were. Apparently, this wasn't the first incident in the park's history. Far from it, actually, having a long list of lawsuits and scandals. But it was the last straw, and eventually they were forced to close. Yesterday was the first day of demolition. I watched it in person, one-man audience, and it felt good. I was getting ready to leave around midday when a commotion in the site held me. "Axe! Grab the axe!" The crew was in mayhem, and advantageous to my curiosity, no one was around to stop me hopping the barrier to get a closer look. "It's dead! Stop! It's dead!" I was too far to see where the men were standing over and crept closer. "Fucker, that's the world record! Call someone." "Who?" "The police, animal control, call someone, Christ's sake." "Where did you find it?" "In here." "Well, go check it. Be careful, too." I felt my way along a bulldozer, close enough now, and stuck my head past the edge. The scene made my knees buckle. I couldn't comprehend what I was looking at. Dead, and covered in hacks and slash marks, was a python. Never mind a snake, it was the largest animal I'd ever seen up close, long as a school bus, longer even, stretched out. Despite its size, it looked thin, as if it hadn't eaten in weeks. "Tell me what happened," one of the construction crew asked a younger member. We was using the machine and clearing out the area like yous asked. Went and knocked over them porta-potties and the dragon came, rearing its head, out one of them holes beneath." The crew began to buzz, taking pictures of the beast and kicking it. The construction man nodded and called for the worker who had gone to check the hole. "Come on out. That's a shithole, nothing to find." "But, boss!" The site fell silent. "What is it?" "There's bones. There's bones down there." I woke up screaming the next morning. Wandered around the house until I went for the newspaper. After all the pieces were collected, the bones they found belonged to 10 unique skeletons. It was a reticulated python, the invasive one, 26 feet long. Found the humidity of the park nice and chose a place it wouldn't be found. Headlined the local paper for a day before it was pulled. Previous owners of the park still had some influence in the area. And what did I get? Closure? I would have rather been buried with my unanswered questions.